First of all, I want to say hello to all the participants of this webinar and also to all the other participants that might have a look on this webinar later on. It's a great pleasure to have Elin McCallum here as a speaker today. She's has specialized in entrepreneurial education for the past 14 years, and she's a co-founder of a non-profit organization that has been very active in innovating and experimenting in the arena of entrepreneurial learning. As such, she contributes and is contributing actively to a more prosperous Europe, as I would see it, by helping to develop creative mindsets, educator skills, digital innovation, and especially how entrepreneurial education can support active citizenship. And I'm very proud that I'm with the INTRINSIC project. I have the opportunity to work together with such brilliant minds and nice people. So I'm very much looking forward to this webinar. And before Elin is going to start to present her work on the EntreComp framework and on her new project, the EntreComp Edu project, I just would like to draw the attention of the participants to their possibilities to interact with us. So in this webinar, you find a question and answer section. And I highly recommend that if you have some questions that come to your mind during the webinar, please type them into the Q&A section, and we are going to answer these questions, or Elin mostly is going to answer these questions at the end of the webinar. So please make use of the Q&A section and so we can collect your questions there and use the opportunity to have Elin here to answer all your questions with regard to the implementation of the EntreComp framework, and also with regard to teacher training, which is EntreComp Edu about.
Okay, so thank you very much to Andreas and to the INTRINSIC EU project for inviting me. I have seen the selection of speakers that you've got in this webinar series, and truly I'm delighted to be following Colin Jones from Queen's University of Technology in Australia, and really pleased to be I think next is Martin Lackas,
yes,
from Chalmers, and both of them doing some brilliant work. The signature pedagogy stuff from Colin is fantastic, and value creation pedagogy. A lot of my learning and my understanding comes from Martin. So we draw a lot on some really great people who are working in this area. So congratulations for getting them on this webinar series, really. Okay, fantastic. Now what I want to talk about today, I'll share my screen, is very much just an introduction to EntreComp, which you might recognize the flower behind me, and then taking you into EntreComp Edu as an introduction to a teacher training project that's trying to translate, adapt EntreComp into a teacher, the professionalization of teachers scenario. So, and I'll try and do that in half an hour. Let's see how we go. Andreas, if I'm going wildly over time, do let me know. Okay, great. So Bantony Education, as Andreas said, is a non-profit organization. We're based in Belgium. We work mainly in Europe, but also around the world with partners in South America, Asia, Southern Africa, on entrepreneurial learning. We are passionate about trying to bring together practices, trying to innovate those practices, really share learning so we can push forward the boundaries of what we understand and what we do around entrepreneurial learning. My background, I'm a youth worker originally, and then I became a policymaker in Welsh government, and then I worked in European Commission. What I believe is that these skills that we talk about here, these are life skills. These are, they're supporting our young people to really realize their potential in society, in their careers, and as future entrepreneurs, future social entrepreneurs, future community activists, if that's what they choose to do. So really trying to support them to get the skills, the mindset they need to take themselves forward in their lives. And this really resonates for me from sort of almost coming full circle back to my work when I was 24, 23 in the South Wales valleys. with young people. So what I want to talk to you about today, first of all, is EntreComp, really looking at understanding the entrepreneurship key competence. At European level, there are 8 key competencies in the key competence framework. If you Google EU competence framework, you'll find that. And EntreComp is one of these. A sense of initiative and entrepreneurship was defined back in 2006. And it was revised again in just last year, became the entrepreneurship key competence. And EntreComp was designed to help people understand what that key competence really means. It was about breaking down the description of that key competence, which was about, translating ideas into action, looking at, within social, financial, cultural scenarios, really trying to break that down into what it would mean for learning, what it would mean to translate that into the classroom at any level, what it might mean to translate that into employment competencies. So the purpose driving EntreComp to create a common language around that, trying to create the understanding, trying to define the competencies that can be developed through education, through lifelong learning. They can be taught, they can be learned. And then to try and really create understanding about a progression, a sense of progression across these competencies. Because when we talk about creativity, what does that mean in different levels? When we talk about having vision, how do we develop that across the age range? When we talk about the ability to take the initiative, how does that translate into learning at primary? How does it translate into learning in higher education, in adult education? So really, it's also an opportunity for stakeholders to recognize what they do as related to EntreComp. It helps mainstream learning to really support entrepreneurial value creation, the development of these competencies and how they can support learners to understand that they can impact the world around them. They can create different kinds of value to support society, to support the economy, to support their local culture. And that's where a new definition of entrepreneurship, this key competence, was brought in through EntreComp. Acting on opportunities and ideas and transforming them into value for others. And that value, financial, cultural, or social. Now, this is not a new definition. It was actually developed by the Danish Foundation of Entrepreneurship and Young Enterprise in Denmark, of course, back in 2011. But when this framework comes from a combined intelligence of many, many people brought together by the European Commission, DG Employment, led by the Joint Research Centre. Margarita Bacigalupu is a great person to follow on Twitter. She's the architect of this. She really led the creation of it. There are different perspectives that went into EntreComp. And I know when we talk to higher education, we often want to think, well, what's the real theory behind this? What's the sort of the evidence base behind this? And there is much. There is a whole evidence document behind it. But also, it draws on consensus of experts who have been working in this field from different perspectives for many years. And you can see here, EntreComp is those 15 competencies broken into 3 areas. And we'll go into that in a little bit more depth. In order to try and support EntreComp to go into action, the Commission decided to develop a user guide. If you look at the QR code there, that'll take you to a direct link for that user guide. It offers you a simple, straightforward understanding. Look at the first 30 pages. There are lots of pictures, not so much text. For those who are a bit like, don't show me 200 pages. It's a 200-page document. The first part is very much an explanation of EntreComp, understanding it, how to use it, its relevance. In a user-friendly approach. The last 170 pages is 74 case studies from schools to universities to VET, FE education for the UK side, to youth work, to employment, to startup. So there's huge numbers of case studies there about how people are actually using this. But what I want to do is I want to take you into just to give you a bit of a vision of what these 15 competencies are. They're in 3 areas. The first one, ideas and opportunities. And you can see here, it's imagination, ideas, vision, making the most of the ideas and that creativity that your brain has produced and understanding the value of that. And also thinking about the ethical impact of the work you do. One important piece of research that EntreComp brought up was about out of, I don't know, 100 odd sort of entrepreneurship programs, few of them, we're talking, I could, under 10%, addressed ethical and sustainable thinking. And yet in our time, in the world we live in the world we have lived in for decades, this is essential. So it became very important to have this in here. And this is the impact of your ideas, the impact of the actions that you take. This very much then links it into both being an entrepreneur and understanding the impact you have, whether you're a for-profit or a social enterprise. But also then you can think about this in terms of looking at the world around you and creating a positive impact. It's also then about looking at your, it could be supporting democracy. It could be looking at issues like period poverty and how to tackle that, empowering women and girls to access education in different ways and looking at the barriers that create that. So this is ideas and opportunities. The second one, resources. Resources about my resource. Who am I? What do I bring to a situation? And then sort of looking at your self-efficacy. Self-awareness and self-efficacy, which since I worked on EntreComp, self-efficacy has become a phrase that just trips off my tongue. Not so much everywhere, I realize this. And it really is that believing in yourself, understanding the strengths that you bring to a situation. What potential do you have to contribute? Knowing yourself. Huge amount of reflection on your own skills come into here, which sadly doesn't necessarily always happen in an education environment. Reflection is so important for understanding what you've learned, what you've gained, where you've progressed as an individual with your skills as well as your knowledge. Motivation and perseverance, mobilizing resources, material resources, but also non-material resources. Get what you need to make your idea happen. Have the financial and economic know-how to make it happen. That's important. It's probably the most knowledge-based competence that's in EntreComp actually. And then mobilizing others. That spirit of negotiation, persuasion, and being able to communicate your ideas and really for people to have a belief in what you're trying to achieve. Very important. And that oracy is what many people might call that. The ability to communicate is being increasingly, has always been important, but is that word oracy is often coming into conversations about education more and more now. Into action. Go for it. Take the initiative. Take that first step. Whatever you want to do. It might be small, it might be big. Take that first step. Understand how to plan those steps, but also understand that nothing happens in the seamless way that you might imagine it with that plan. There will always be things that you don't expect. And education, learning environments need to not have this, not necessarily just provide learners with a process that is A to B. They need to familiarize learners with the understanding that life might not always be A to B. Life might be A to B via D, Z, and H. And D, Z, and H you didn't expect. And they felt a bit weird when they came along. But, by the time I actually went through D, Z, and H, I was kind of like, I'm a bit more familiar with the unexpected now. I'm a bit more comfortable with how that feels to myself. And so that being able to deal with uncertainty, ambiguity, and risk is not just about risk management. It's not just about understanding your risk and measuring it. It's also having the experience of going through that. And this is where EntreComp is so much about the experiential, about the doing, about the experiencing, because many of these competencies, you experience them by doing them. They're triggered by learning situations. They may not be so explicit within, you don't necessarily call a module uncertainty, but you build an element of uncertainty into your module by putting in different scenarios that the students didn't expect at the beginning, but they have to deal with through it. And that will prepare them well for the uncertainty that is absolutely inevitable in real life. Same with working with others. conflict comes into any working relationship, any relationship that you have in the world. Nothing's ever plain, smooth, simple. Being able to team up, being able to collaborate, being able to network, being able to understand different people's perspectives, being able to understand that people come from different directions, people bring different value, people have... people are not always easy either, but you still might have to work with them and be with them in whatever scenario. So this, really understanding this and allowing young people, not necessarily just young, to experience and learn from productive working with others, and then learning through experience. I really did mention reflection earlier, and it's crucial. Reflection is you learn by doing, but you reflect back on that doing to truly understand and be empowered by the competencies that you've developed. Because if you don't, what you often find in education is you might go through the process of a great practical learning experience. It was learning by doing. You collaborated with stakeholders. You had real life scenarios, and you're going to have gained a lot from that. As a student, be you PhD or be you primary. You spoke to a business person, you dealt with the mayor of your local town, you campaigned on something, you sold something, whatever you did, you will have got value. But what would really bring you value is if those people, those students, whatever age they are, really reflect back on what they learned, how they learned it, and how that can be, those things they learn can be used in their future lives. That is about empowering through competence. And that, again, is not necessarily something that happens so often. Make these competencies explicit in the planning, in the process, in the reflection, in the learning objectives, in the activities, in the assessment. That's very, very crucial. So if you want to know more about the competencies, there are 15 very useful videos on YouTube. You can see the link there, and I'm sure you'll be able to download these slides so you can access the link there. There's one on each and an overview. So it's just 2.5 minutes on each competence, just to understand a little flavour of what it is and how you might develop it in teaching, in learning. I wanted to go into a little bit about social culture and financial value. I think this is something quite important because people sometimes think, well, what does that really mean? Surely entrepreneurship is just about business, but being entrepreneurial. EntreComp is about being entrepreneurial. And that's something that expands across life. I now am a social entrepreneur. And I've been a civil servant, and I've set up a youth project. I've been entrepreneurial in that sense in different scenarios. I've campaigned as well, and I've created campaigns, and that's being entrepreneurial. Student parliaments, looking at how you preserve your local heritage, celebrating, activities to celebrate and preserve language. I come from Wales, broadly speaking, and, we want to always preserve heritage and language in Wales as a minority language. But there's also that creating financial value, and the activities you can do to do that are broad and varied. What is creating financial value? Cooperatives, social impact ventures, things that are more familiar, spin-outs, business, venture creation. But also, what is financial change modelling to drive change can be interesting in higher education. Looking at teams of students, developing the efficiency of an NGO would really develop some of these competencies. Or simply, local businesses delivering to students a challenge they're experiencing and looking to solve that. So you can see the competencies, these competencies can be developed in a creative way, and the value that you create for others, that again makes the learning more relevant for the student, because they see, okay, I created this value, or we created this value. EntreComp can be individual or team. And that is something that, again, like the competencies, is empowering. It really builds confidence if you realize the power that you have as an individual. And in this world, we need to believe that we have power and influence as an individual, because so often we don't feel that. So I won't go too much into the depth of EntreComp. You can read EntreComp into action, and it's very much, easily understood. The competencies break down into building blocks or threads, so that, creativity isn't just creativity, this big block. It becomes being curious, developing ideas, defining problems, designing value. Mobilizing resources becomes managing, using, making the most of your resources, getting support. Working with others is accepting diversity, developing emotional intelligence, very important these days. Again, a phrase that's coming through more and more in the education world. Working together, expanding your network. And these are mapped, each of those building blocks, those threads, are mapped across the progression model. And you can see here, it goes from foundation to expert, from discovering to transforming. It's increasing level of complexity, but also increasing levels of autonomy. At the expert level, you're really looking at high-level development, complex development. At the beginner level, you're really looking at doing something with the support of others, under supervision. And for each of those progression, each one has a learning outcome. In order to really try and reflect the progression of how something like you can see here, developing ideas, how does that develop from beginner through to expert? And never expect that, for example, with your PhD students, they would always be at the expert level. Not necessarily. They can crisscross along this progression model, just like a primary school student will crisscross along that. They wouldn't always be at the foundation level. You'd be very surprised. Out of the box thinking drops rapidly from primary school onwards. So creativity really can work. Perhaps planning, it might be slightly more developed at PhD. But there we go. I digress. And you can see here, this kind of, you've got the competence areas, you've got the competencies, you've got these threads, these building blocks, and then you've got the learning outcomes across the progression levels. Don't be daunted by the complexity of EntreComp. It's more like a dictionary that you can dip into. You look at creativity, you think, okay, I want to focus on developing ideas and defining problems. You look at that, you then look across and think, okay, let's look at what learning outcomes might be relevant. And then let's get inspired by a few case studies that have done that. And this is where you use EntreComp to mobilize others. You have this flower at the center that shows what being entrepreneurial is, that translates it actually into the language of different people. I've taken this in front of different audiences, and to explain it means people understand what this being entrepreneurial is, that is relevant beyond business. I want to create value. I can adapt this to different scenarios. I can understand it to different sectors, to different subjects, to different levels of education. I can assess how I'm doing with EntreComp. I can map the competencies, even the threads, across my course, my module, because, well, did I actually develop what I wanted to develop? That kind of virtuous circle of constructive alignment, where you look at the sort of your learning objectives through to your activities, through to your assessment, in order to understand whether you're doing the full circle. EntreComp can really help with that when it comes to being entrepreneurial and the competencies that you're looking at. If you plan it, your activities should reflect it, your assessment should reflect it, and your students know thy impact. As John Hattie says, know thy impact. Do your students feel that they've developed those competencies? You can map from a very basic level. Do I think they're included? And then when you're implementing new or redesigned courses, you can say, right, I want to really understand, did I deliver this? And then I want to recognize the competencies, these competencies that my students have developed. So if you go to EntreComp Interaction, all of the case studies are then mapped across those 5 uses, objectives, if you like, of EntreComp. And here you can see the different types. This is all in EntreComp Interaction. Okay, so that's a very brief skip through EntreComp. I'm hoping I did that in about 15 minutes. Good. Andreas is giving me the thumbs up, so I'm taking it. I'm fairly on track. So now I'm going to go into a project. I don't usually deliver, a kind of multiple presentation on the 2 things. So I'm going to take a little drink of coffee, and then I'm going to go into EntreComp Edu, which is a really interesting project. What we recognise, this is an opportunity, this project, to translate EntreComp into what it means for teachers. We talk a lot. I have been in situations, been in conversations, been in projects. We've talked a lot about, teachers need these entrepreneurial skills. We need entrepreneurial teachers to deliver entrepreneurial skills. Well, yeah, that would be lovely. But actually, if we're saying that these entrepreneurial skills, that EntreComp is a key competence. The European Commission and all the member states in Europe agreed that this key competence needed to happen across education, across all subjects. And it needed to happen at every level of education, across lifelong learning. Okay, so, well, if that's the case, then, not every teacher may have, just like not every student may have the full complement of EntreComp skills and mindset. To be honest, if you were expert level in EntreComp, the 15 competencies, you would be superhuman. I think, in no way. What I often do here is I say, think of your strength. What is your EntreComp strength? Mine probably, I'm quite creative. I come up with a lot of ideas. I need support. I need to mobilize others and resources to get those ideas to fruition, because sometimes I'm not so brilliant at planning. And I need to force myself to learn from experience. So, not everybody is brilliant at this. And, my business partner, Rebecca Weicht, is the opposite to me. She's incredibly efficient. Really planning is an absolute forte. Getting stuff done is just fantastic, which is why we work well together. If I had someone else like me, I'd be a nightmare. So this is it, people are diverse, people complement. And that's, it's not about being brilliant in everything. So when I come to teachers, all teachers are different. Not every teacher is an extrovert. Not every teacher has, is brilliant with technology and incredibly creative, and the diversity is important. My kids have a job share teacher, and their two teachers that they have every week are very different, and they get different things, different experiences, different gains from having that diversity in their teaching. Anyway, I digress again. So EntreComp Edu is about translating these EntreComp skills, mindset, these competencies into actually not being an entrepreneurial teacher, but being a teacher who can develop student entrepreneurial skills through their teaching. It's about developing the pedagogical knowledge, the skills, the experience, the confidence to include these competencies in their teaching, to realize the value of them, to understand how to plan them in, to deliver them, to then be able to assess them, and to look at reflecting back, and also your professional development. So what we do in EntreComp Edu is, again, try and empower to rethink the skills you have, because sometimes it's not about a radical change. It's about a small change. Sometimes it's about, well, let's introduce a bit more of a real life context rather than perhaps just, work from this scenario that we've worked on so long already. And that brings in already some of the competencies. We're looking at developing resources, giving teachers the tools that they need to improve, to support them, to adapt, to change, to see where they can look. And also we want to build a bridge between classroom through to policy, because EntreComp Edu is a policy reform project. We need to look at using this learning from what we're doing into creating an argument that this needs to be supported from the policy level. Now, people might say, well, it is supported from the policy level. Yes, it is from the European level, and many countries talk about these skills. But sometimes the connection between the policy and the classroom is not necessarily always there. And sometimes the connection can stop perhaps at the institution level. Perhaps the curriculum framework is quite rigid. Perhaps your modules are fixed. You can't change them. So it's just looking again at what the barriers are and seeing, okay, how can we look at that? EntreComp Edu, as you may understand from how I'm talking, is directed at schools and vocational education. But the learning that we're developing, I think, is very relevant for higher education. And we've got a lot of higher education interested in what we're doing. It's a consortium that involves 6 countries. We'll be piloting in 6 countries, and we've also got Sweden involved as well through Me Analytics, through Martin Lacaze, and his organisation. So we've got some really good people involved in there. And obviously, what is being produced is again, a bit like EntreComp, a consensus approach to how we can develop this. Because we're trying new things and we're still experimenting. But what we are doing is we're creating a framework, so a reference point for the competencies that teachers need to include EntreComp and entrepreneurial education. So we're rethinking what are the competencies that teachers need. This may link to pedagogical knowledge, skills, experience. We're looking at we have developed a self-assessment tool to provide feedback as a first step. This is actually being led by Lappeenranta University of Technology in Finland, and is actually a national tool. It's being a redeveloped national tool in Finland. So we're incorporating this into the project, and this will then flow into teacher training. And the teacher training is based on this framework that I'll go into in a moment. We're trialling the teacher training in 2020, first of all with a pilot group from the countries that are involved, and then also we'll have an open access available on a global basis to teachers that want to help us understand whether it works or not. So the pilots will be going ahead quite soon in order to test, and then we'll redesign and relaunch for a wider audience. And from the teacher training, we'll be collating practical examples of how teachers think they can deliver these competencies in their education. And they're all free online. So this is something that will be an accessible resource. So what the framework does, it really supports teachers to deliver these competencies. It supports them to see where they're at, to understand their progress in this. And the 5 competencies, I'm going to go into the framework now. Now, this is the project was designed in response to a call from a policy reform project call from DG Education. And it was the professionalisation of teachers. So we thought it's an opportunity to think about this in a different way. So we've got 5 areas here that actually look quite generic. When you look at knowledge and understanding, planning and organisation, teaching and training, assessment, professional learning and development, these are areas that every teacher will recognise as core to what they do. And that was very purposeful. We've got a combination of people behind this who are from an education science background, professional teacher educationists, and from an entrepreneurship education background. So really trying to combine this into something that looks like an education science approach, but it's about what is particular about these areas for entrepreneurial learning, for delivering these competencies. So the self-assessment tool will be available in 6 languages. The MOOC will reflect the EntreComp Edu competence areas that I've just described. I'm not going to go into too much detail here because I'm conscious of time. And then the practice map will be by teachers for teachers. And this is all going to be coming in 2020. But what you can do, first of all, is you can go onto the entrecompedu.eu website and you can see the very sort of the pre-publication draft of this framework. And I'm going to take you through that now just to perhaps to illustrate what kind of competencies we feel from our research are relevant. So this professional knowledge and understanding of entrepreneurial education is very simply knowing, valuing, and understanding how learners develop entrepreneurial competencies. It's about this ability to recognize entrepreneurial competencies, to understand what they are, why they're there, why they're important for the potential of my students, and how my students best develop them. And that might be in different ways. Also reflecting perhaps different avenues, so primary, secondary, special needs, vocational education. Planning and organisation, we defined 3 goals within this, 3 competencies. We needed to understand how teachers can set entrepreneurial learning goals, and that are ethical and sustainable. And this, again, is sort of a double theme here. The entrepreneurial learning goals, this reflects the nature of learning. They need to be able to include these competencies into their planning to understand how the activities then need to relate back to the learning goals. And they need to build in that social, moral, ethical, sustainable aspect into the work that they do. And this is something that, it's all about that sort of creating value, and that runs through the whole of the module. Making connections, trying to understand that entrepreneurial learning is fully integrated both within and across subjects. Now, this can be about multidisciplinary learning. It can also be about connecting beyond the classroom. And the learning space, the learning environment in which people are functioning, understanding the space within which children, young people learn, and understanding that space is influential. So to encourage entrepreneurial learning, it is about considering the space you have and sometimes, perhaps limited capacity you have to change that space. But you can also you have the classroom, you can go beyond the classroom. So it's thinking of different learning spaces and thinking of the way you set up your own learning space and the time you use and how you use it and the technology. The third competence, teaching and training, is very much about looking at enthusing and engaging. So we use the word instruction here because this is very core to teaching, but the using instruction that is enthusing and engaging students. So this is really about motivating students to learn, looking at this, understanding learning to learn, understanding student engagement. And how they can use entrepreneurial teaching to promote that, to really work for that. It's also then, demonstrating the value to teachers. The second one, they're creating value for others. This very much, is inspired by EntreComp and will bring in some of the work that is obviously inspired by Martin Lackas, who will be talking next week. So this is really about understanding how they can pursue interests, consider solutions, alternatives, follow inquiry, but create value for others through their learning. We try and bring that out as a sort of a theme throughout as well. And we're sort of working, I think the second phase of our CPD will hopefully try and make sure that we need to check that what we're planning through this is effectively our learning objectives, will, in that perfect circle, come out from the teacher's experience of going through the training. So the last one, the third one, teaching through real world context. I don't need to explain that really, to bring in the world into your teaching, either physically, people, relevance in terms of relating what you're learning to the real world. It could be going out into the real world. It could be bringing in challenges, contexts, global, local, business, community, environment, those. And building self-awareness, self-confidence through learning. This is actually the self-awareness, self-efficacy, returned because it was felt that this would be a better way of presenting it within this. And then the last one, promoting productive working with others. This is really about collaborative learning. It's not just group work, but it's trying to make sure that group work really produces the learning outcomes that are highlighted within EntreComp, working for others and mobilizing others, but also in this sort of very much education side, which is collaborative learning, which is seen to be very powerful tool and can have very strong, deep learning for the student. The fourth one, assessment. This is not the easiest one. Assessment is tough. Now, we have looked here from a perspective of checking and reporting on progress. And this is progress for the student, but progress for the teacher as well. Monitoring, reporting on what students know, understand, and can do in their entrepreneurial learning. The second one, sharing feedback and making sure the students know what and how they need to improve. And they're also being involved in assessing their own progress. And this is very important because it brings in the reflection that is so key to entrepreneurial learning. The last one, recognizing progress and achievement. Again, this could be seen as summative, but it's not summative assessment. It's also about recognizing the value that's being created, bringing in stakeholders to look and feedback on the product of learning, the process of learning, to hear from students about what their journey, if you like. So it's not just about being the end result. It's also the reflection and sharing that reflection with others from outside the school environment, making sure that, I know Martin's work really focuses on the importance of having creating value and sharing that for someone outside your peer group, and through that process having involvement of others. And this is one way to have involvement of others. Obviously, there are multiple ways across this as well. The final one, professional learning and development. And this is about the teacher as an individual and potentially as a teacher team, to reflect, to try and move their practice forward through training, through researching practice, and creating networks in order to try to really enrich what they know, how they do it, and to share practice. So this is very much a core part of trying to build networks, trying to build evidence-based practice, and trying to build reflection on practice. So that's a very quick skip through EntreComp Edu. The focus of it right now is this framework, which we've translated into CPD phase 1. And we will be testing that in early 2020 before going out to wider testing, which I will certainly share with Andreas, so that he could share it with the networks involved in INTRINSIC, in order to bring in different people into our phase 2 testing, so that you can tell us whether it's what you expected and whether it actually helps your teaching, because that's what it needs to do. And, this has been a challenging project. It's really been difficult to understand, create consensus, to create an agreement on a way forward, because there's such it's putting things down that perhaps, you could do this in different ways. And so we're trying this way at the moment, and then we see, well, what do we need to change for phase 2? And it will be an interesting year next year to see how this project evolves. But at the core of it, it is about supporting teachers to deliver EntreComp competencies through their teaching, to deliver then entrepreneurial learning processes through their teaching, because it's not always the same thing. You can develop creativity, but that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to always have an opportunity to allow the ideas, that creativity to flow into putting it into action. So we're trying to look at that dual process of developing competencies and developing entrepreneurial learning processes. So this brings me to the end, and I'm hoping there might be some questions, but also just wanted to give you a picture of some other projects and publications we've been involved with. A lot of it links to EntreComp. EntreComp Edu is at the top here. Beneath that, you've got Cradle, which is a primary school project on language learning, linked to entrepreneurial learning. The next two are perhaps projects that will be of interest. Entrepreneurship 360 is a one-stop shop for EntreComp that will be launched probably early Q1, Q2 next year. And EntreComp Europe is a systemic piloting of EntreComp with 5 countries, Moldova, Turkey, Spain, Italy, and Belgium, to try and test it, to try and adapt it, to try and see whether these different projects that have been developed can be translated, scaled up. Again, it's very much a policy focus within that to explore and then try and provide the evidence to scale. Entrepreneurial.education is a wiki. It's a very simple wiki that we've built to basically provide an online resource for EntreComp into action and any other EntreComp related practices. So you can go in there, and EntreComp Connect was a conference we ran this year, which produced 27 personas. How does an activist use EntreComp competencies? How does a teacher use EntreComp competencies to try and understand the different ways in which people use competencies through these personas, and also then tools and practices from across Europe, from the people that came to the conference and beyond. So that's a wiki that brings together lots of learning from EntreComp Connect and EntreComp Interaction. Parentpreneurs is about translating the framework to parents. EntreAssess is a very interesting project where we've tried to develop the vision and understanding of how to assess these competencies. Great resources in there. And LME is, again, translating how do we develop this with refugee entrepreneurs and entrepreneurs from a migrant background. So those are the kinds of projects that we're involved in, all of them really using EntreComp, because we believe it's a good tool. I'm hoping that was around about half an hour, and I'm very open for questions. I probably have forgotten something, I always do, but Andreas, over to you.
So thank you very much, Elin. This was really an extremely interesting presentation, and also the outlook that you have given on the other projects is also extremely inspiring. My question would be, how do you anticipate how do you provide these activities or to the teachers that they can implement? So what is your plan? So we have roughly the idea of just a spreadsheet where we make a description, which is always looking the same, but has different activities in there. So what is your ideas about that?
I think there's three things I would mention here. Possibly, I mean, there's a lot of projects out there. Take a look in EntreComp Interaction. There's the 3 E's project, for example. Providing entrepreneurial learning activities. Sometimes, particularly for higher education, they have a strong business focus. But it doesn't mean that they're not relevant and adaptable. I would say, obviously, for someone looking to introduce these competencies into their teaching, the first thing to look at is what do you already develop, and this is looking at both your method and approach of teaching, enabling your students to learn, and what products, what process does your student go through to evidence and develop their learning and produce the final artifact that evidences their learning. What are those, and what competencies do you think a student uses through that process? Mm-hmm. Because these competencies are transversal, but it's sometimes in how you teach alongside the what you teach. So you don't have to introduce a business focus, but you may need to look at how you teach, the themes that you teach, in order to make it more exploratory, in terms of supporting your students to explore themselves around a topic, rather than perhaps, and I don't mean just research then, I mean sort of something more creative, looking at a challenge that's related to life sciences and exploring around that. One resource that would be really good for this project is the ETC toolkit. So this is intended to support universities to introduce these kinds of competencies into their teaching. And they split this approach into of the competencies for broad-based learning. You have the enterprising education, which is the creativity, the taking the initiative, and then you have the entrepreneurship education, which is very much sort of all the business focus. Sort of the sharp end, if you like. So they provide guidance to universities in the UK on how to introduce this into courses. So I think that would be a great resource. And just to say that I was in the UIIN conference earlier this year, in June, I believe, in Helsinki. And there was a great presentation. I wasn't able to go, but it was a very, very interesting presentation I hear, and I need to catch up on it, about teaching through SDGs by the Technical University of Amsterdam, Ingrid Wacky.
So the problem for a teacher is that usually there is some hurdle between the resources and their everyday practice at the university, right? So this is not a small hurdle, and so the the idea is really how to break these activities and all this down in a way and make it interesting for those domain specialists to be integrated into something like molecular modeling or whatsoever. So I see that is a really big challenge. And on the other hand, we have several very interested teachers that are already implementing entrepreneurship education, and these are our starting points at the universities. What are your ideas to bring it really into the everyday life of a teacher?
I think this is the core here, and this is something that is so important. Teacher practices, is part of what we're trying to produce from EntreComp Edu. Because what we have a lot of is case studies, but what we don't have so much of is kind of like learning plans, learning and assessment examples of how these competencies have been built into history, physics, English, in order to develop these competencies as a core part. And this is what needs to happen. And this will be very, very interesting if this is something that the INTRINSIC project does. Now, if you sit down a set of lecturers and, you could, literally, and this is what we're looking at doing across different projects now, is asking people to bring in an example of what they teach, right? Their plan and some detail behind that, and to do group work on, okay, how do I introduce creativity into this? How can I introduce creativity into this? How can I build in stakeholder engagement into this in order to work in more? How can I bring group work into this more effectively? How can I measure then the outcomes, the competence outcomes from that? So, and to actually look at small workshops within your project, perhaps, to do that. Because, you can take a red pen and, the hive mind can be a powerful tool in this situation. And this is what we're looking to do on a number of projects, because that practice, learning and assessment practice is perhaps what we need to develop more of in order to provide those complete, coherent examples of where some or all of these competencies are developed. What we have is varying pots of practices, but sometimes they don't always relate directly to what you need. So molecular modelling is possibly not in there. But, I'm sure there are molecular modelers the world over who would be interested to understand how I can build creativity into my molecular modelling.
That's a very good point. And to find a way to really get these teachers into kind of workshops where they start with their own learning. So we have two components. We have the teacher. We have the teacher who is maybe more interested in creativity. The other one is more interested in the financial part of the issue, or is more value oriented to bring something to the developing world. And on the other hand, we have the domain. So it's molecular modeling. So we have, let's say, at least two components which are very relevant for which activity a teacher will or which activity he or she will implement in her teaching, right? So in principle, this is a very interesting fact that I discovered in our discussion now, that we have at least these two components that need to be integrated when we would like to invite teachers to take up our modules for teaching.
Yeah. And this is it. But if you're looking at doing that kind of workshop with practitioners, we're looking to do that kind of workshop with practitioners too. So perhaps we can share some ideas on how best to create that idea storming of how do I EntreComp my learning plans?
So we are at the end, basically, of the webinar. So thank you very much, Elin. Of course, the resource itself, the webinar we produced, is of extremely high value. So it was an extreme condensed overview of the EntreComp and what is, I would say, cutting edge on bringing entrepreneurship education to life in schools and universities. So thank you very much, Elin, for this. I hope we stay in contact and keep our fresh minds going on into the direction of making Europe that creative place in the world that we all think of.
Great, absolutely. And thank you very much for the opportunity. My emails are below now, so if anybody wants to get in touch with me directly, please do. I'm happy to have a conversation. Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks. And with this, we will stop the webinar. Thanks to all the participants also participating in the webinar and educating themselves by these great initiatives that are going on currently in Europe. And I'm sure that video will have a big outreach also on your platform, Elin, and also on ours. So thank you very much and goodbye, and see you back in one of our next webinars.